So I'm here with former editor Tank and current contributor and friend of the mag, Josie Mitchell, to talk about Sally Potter's Orlando, which is currently streaming on Tank TV until midnight this Friday, the 17th of January. Potter's film forms part of our first season, Beyond Varda, which celebrates the legacy of Agnes Varda with 10 films by female directors for whom she laid a cinematic foundation. So to start off, Josie, I wondered if you could just kind of give us the overview. What's this film? What's going on? What makes it an essential watch almost 30 years after its initial release?
The plot of Orlando essentially follows one person through history. So Orlando, played by Tilda Swinton, is this young sort of ingenue favourite of Queen Elizabeth at the very beginning of the film, and it sort of starts in 1600 and then goes all the way up to the present day, and that journey, Orlando doesn't really age or sort of matures very slowly, and all of these different eras through England pass, and his fortunes go up and down over the course. But the key thing that happens is there's this moment, sort of this mysterious moment about halfway through, where Orlando the boy or man becomes Orlando the woman, and it has some serious consequences in that Orlando, who owns a very large estate in England, suddenly doesn't anymore because he's a she and she can't own property. But it's not really done in a way that's serious or painful. It's done quite lightly and amusingly, and sort of, or Tilda Swinton as Orlando is sort of just floating through this life, observing the strange behaviours of these like weirdos. But it's gorgeous. I think that's the thing that I think about it watching it now, is it's really intricate, and it does so much more than just, it seems to really get the sense of the original book for me. That's the thing I like about this film, is because I think so much of what Virginia Woolf was doing in the book is she's not just going through history with this static voice that's the same all the way through. She changes the way she writes to fit the era. So she like starts in, you know, the Tudor period, and it's ornate Orlando, like sort of like favourite of the Queen, and as it moves through, she sort of like makes fun of the 17th century and its morality and wit, makes fun of the Victorian like obsession with ornament, you know, and as you go through, style is so important. You can start in like the very first scene, you have Quentin Crisp playing Elizabeth I and Tilda Swinton playing this young male favourite, and already you just have this gender swapping outrageousness. Or rather, the outrageousness is what they're wearing. Like, everyone is wearing outrageous things. Everybody is like dramatically camping up, and it has this very 90s awareness. Like, drag is obviously something that's being played with, but in a way that seems to sort of push it back into history.
And then I think it also might just be useful to say something quickly about who Quentin Crisp was, because I think it's quite important to the context that you're referring to there, and I guess just the film's handling of gender more generally.
I think the key thing actually is that in 1998, Quentin Crisp turned 90, so he would have been about 84 when the film was filmed. And at the age of 90, he came to realisation that he was a trans woman, and publicly announced that. So I think maybe 6 years prior to that, it was already percolating in the air. This was somebody who had been brave enough to explore gender non-conformity in the public eye, and so to bring somebody who had that association into the film, I think is probably a probably relatively quite profound gesture of...
Yeah, especially, I mean, like, in 1992, that was a very different kind of thing than it would be.
Yeah, and I think what it did quite nicely in the film is it sort of points to this idea, it levels a sense of gender performance. So when you're in the opening scene and everybody is performing, everyone is performing gender very vividly. Like Quentin Crisp is playing the Queen, Tilda Swinton is playing a boy. You've got this emphasis not on Orlando as being like a freak of nature, this like strange being, this alien that moves through normal humanity through time and is immortal. The emphasis is on everybody here. And I sort of love that. It's not it's not the story of somebody who's experiencing gender confusion. It's somebody who's very much a boy, a man who is sort of experiences like, who has like strong sexual confidence. And do you know what I mean? Is really like embodying his masculinity, fancies a woman, flirts confidently, seduces her, you know, gets betrayed by this woman he's in love with. None of it is sort of, there's no sort of encoded feeling of like otherness or inability to be part of the performance of masculinity. It just happens to be that one day Orlando has a particularly long night's sleep and wakes up a woman. And I think that's really interesting, actually, that it's not about a sense of failure to be a particular gender or sex. It's just like a magic wand gets waved.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well, because there's a kind of, perhaps what makes this quite an essential film to revisit now is that it offers this kind of like very multiple understanding of like gender is like not something that can or should be approached through like one narrative form. And I think that it's interesting to revisit this now, this film that came out in the early 90s, in this context of like 2020, where these ideas of gender and sexuality are like very much in vogue and there's like very much a public discussion around them, but they're also often approached through this kind of like quite stock set of narratives where you're either like suffering because of your gender or you're having this moment of triumphant overcoming. Whereas what you're just saying now about Orlando is that it's just kind of like, it's just the thing that like happens, and it's kind of like, you know, the same way like the weather happens, or like you kind of wake up and you've like sprained your ankle or something. It's like,
yeah, that's it, exactly. I think the affect in it is really interesting because it's not about, there's not really that much pain. There is just not much pain. Things happen to Orlando. Orlando gets betrayed by a lover. Orlando doesn't get to inherit her house. But they're always sort of just these sort of things that slightly ruffle the air briefly, but actually Orlando moves is not destroyed by them. Or even that frustrated. It's sort of like Orlando is on loads and loads of Xanax or something. Do you know what I mean? It's like just Orlando's floating through life. And yeah, there is something quite, it's not queer pain.
And I think it's also interesting the way that ambiguity comes through, where I guess we've spoken a bit about the kind of like the costumery of the film and the way that it kind of, rather than aspiring to this sort of like historical realism, is very much, you know, playing with the idea of fantasy and excess and not seeking to kind of provide any sort of accurate, or like quote unquote accurate, realist depiction of these things. And I think that comes through in Tilda Swinton's performance, especially where, you know, in the first half of the film, if you kind of watch Orlando as a man kissing a woman, you kind of have this knowledge as an audience member, right, that you're kind of watching woman dressed as a man kissing a woman, so what is this? And I think that kind of that ability to lean into kind of like ambiguity and confusion is something that's maybe really interesting about the film.
I 100% agree. And I think that playfulness is also a really strength of the film. There's like a scene shortly after Orlando becomes a woman where she's decked out in like full, you know, net dress thing, and it's this really dramatic, and there's a long room full of furniture that she's got to negotiate. It's been pushed to the walls because maybe there's some painting happening or something, and the scene is just about maybe 2 minutes of her having to completely move laterally, like 180 degrees dress this way, 180 degrees this way, just to move through the room. in a like a Pac-Man or something, and it's so funny, and it's such a clever, very gestural reference to so many things, right? About what it and I think Swinton and Potter do this thing where it's sort of like this character is not so much reacting anxiously or with pain to this discovery, it's just sort of just like amused, like, oh look, I have to do this thing with the dress now. That's funny.
Yeah. And I think the scenes that people very much remember from that film as well, these kind of close-up shots of Tilda Swinton's face where she's breaking the fourth wall and looking right at you. Right. And there's like this real sense of like connecting with this very vivid personality, which is perhaps not just limited to the character that's being portrayed, right?
Absolutely. Those moments are really interesting, where all the way through the story, Tilda Swinton turns to the camera and sort of gives a little charismatic little shorthand. And they're also in a language that is not really of the era, so that it'll be a sort of 21st century interjection. Like, well, you know, broke up with her, but it would never have worked out. And it's, I don't know I love those little bits, which is unusual because normally I find that sort of breaking the wall really annoying. They're really difficult to pull off.
Right. And Sally Potter manages to do it.
Sally Potter manages to do it. Because the whole thing is about performance and play, and it has this campy, theatrical element. It's like Moulin Rouge kind of energy.
But I also think there are moments in the film where those kind of nodding winks to the audience also remind us of the kind of reality that continues outside of that realm of fantasy. So, as you say, it's not really a film about pain, but it's also not a film that ignores pain either. And I think that kind of comes through in those moments. And I'm sort of thinking in particular about the battle scene of Orlando, if that's maybe something you want to speak to a bit.
It's very like Monty Python. You know, it's not a very realistic battle. You know, you've got loads of people in ridiculous dress. You've got a very cheap, almost consciously cheap set, where there's a fake smoke machine and someone like falls down from a 1 meter high rampart, and then one of the characters like shoots someone, bang, and then he dies. And what I found really interesting about that moment is Orlando goes over and it's like, oh no, this person's dying, and the tone completely changes, and there's one of these close-ups on Tilda Swinton's face and the eyes just meet the camera, and it's sort of, you suddenly really, the tone of the scene, this comic slapstick scene, is suddenly completely upended, and there's just a sort of moment where you're being asked, what just happened? Someone just died. And that happens all the way through in these really unexpected moments that I think are very deft and, I don't know, quite daring, because you're constantly risking completely losing the mood or the tone of your film.
When you just said that, what it made me think of is when you're kind of playing a game as a child, and then suddenly there's this moment where it gets a bit out of hand, and like you hit someone or something and someone starts crying, and this kind of collective activity, which is this joyous co-created fantasy, it just suddenly slips away. And I mean, it's an interesting question to think about as well, where especially if you're talking about queerness, where it's very reliant on these kind of like exceptional spaces of fantasy, and you know how sustainable those are and the reality in which those exist. So you kind of like will go out to this club and have this vision of like another world or whatever. There's something like quite utopian about it perhaps, but then there's also that's something that's always slipping away, right? And something that's always at risk or within this like precarious circumstance that could fall away at any time.
Absolutely. I think Victoria Sims said something like, drag is like an embodied version of the speculative. You know, it's constantly like this what if of how you propose yourself. To that point, as a final thing as well, I just think one thing that the film brings together, perhaps to extend that then, is you have this performativity of gender, but you also have this performativity of like the trappings of state. So it is also making fun of and showing the ridiculousness of being being a diplomat in the 17th century with the wig and the ridiculous clothing and the performance of that, and how it is just like a big game. Like, you're sort of, in the same way that you just put a dress on and people are like, oh, you're a woman, you sort of put a long wig on in that context and people are like, oh, you're an important military man. And it's just sort of like, oh, okay, these things just create realities, and these are games that we're playing, but they're games that are also awful.
And of like real consequence as well, which is kind of what you were alluding to earlier.
So you put this ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous costume on with like puffs here, sprouts there, big wig, white wig, lots of fluff, and then you go and like murder a whole load of people. It's really strange. And that is intention, I think, with this sort of idea of any form of clothing, is taking you into a world and taking you over.
To subscribe to Tank TV, our antidote to the streaming mega platforms, you can head to tankmagazine.com/tanktv. That's tankmagazine.com/tanktv. For just £3 a month, you'll get a hand-picked must-see film each week, as well as full access to 20 years of Tank's digital archive.